Hello and welcome to the education webinar that the Hindu conducts every Saturday at 5 p.m. Today we are discussing an upcoming big news event, the budget that is scheduled to be passed on the first, on February 1st, on Sunday for the first time. We are looking at how education, this perennial question of spending on education, India has of course had a very checkered history as far as education is concerned. We started out with some piecemeal efforts towards primary education and higher education. We decided to establish these centers of excellence, and but primary education was not really given the due it should have been given, as many people see from hindsight. At that time, not enough money was spent, and this reflected in the literacy and other aspects of the general population. For instance, it's been well documented that agricultural workers, including farmers, since they were not really literate, they were not able to use the services offered by agriculture extension services to boost farm productivity. So the lack of primary education, or the emphasis on primary education, wasn't really all that much in terms of budgetary commitments, and that sort of took a toll on the general literacy levels of the population, and in turn that reflected on our productivity. Today we know that our Indian labor productivity is just about 20% of, say, in Malaysia, which is like a middle income country. And but over the years there was some awareness, some realization that we just cannot continue like this. So there was a stress on primary education in the 2000s. It was the RTE Act was passed, and universal literacy and numeracy, as it's called now, that became a focus, which is kind of achieved in the sense that most people, most babies that are born today do go to school. That minimum has been achieved, but we now find that the level of literacy and numeracy skills, they are lagging. Private surveys by ESSER, it's an NGO, have time and again established that fact. Now that governments are also accepting that fact, and today the accent is on what's called FLN, foundational literacy and numeracy. And that is something that is to be, it's a work in progress that is happening. There's also been higher education is another story in and of itself. There's been a lot of stress on these centers of excellence, but by and large there has been a recognition, or there has been a sort of realization that India's higher education in the public sphere hasn't yet really kept pace with the kind of demand that is there, given the nature, the age of the population. Even the higher education sector is really nothing much to write about, except for these big centers of excellence that turn out very excellent, skilled people. So that is the situation now, and so we are looking at, we sort of know that India's should be reaping the demographic dividend. Much of the population is still young, but what are we doing to education? We have always talked about increasing, ramping up the investment in education, public investment in education. The new education policy, for instance, talks about increasing it to 6%. They say it's now around 4.5%, although there are some differences of opinion on that. But when do we do this? When do we really ramp up our investment, public investment in school and college education, so that our productivity, our the literacy and so many other benefits that come out of having a very educated population? When will India start doing that, and what should be done now? It's a very broad, interesting question. We feel that the time has come now. It's now, or I don't know when else we can do that. We have a very distinguished set of panelists to sort of sit back and not look at the minutiae of budget so much, but into the larger issue of how much are we spending for education, and can that be increased? Can that be ramped up substantially? And if it is, where should the money go? So we have Vishi Iyer, Vishwanathan Iyer. He's a faculty at the Great Lakes Institute of Management. We have Abhishek Malhotra, who cut his teeth in student politics. He now teaches economics at Delhi University. There's Tikendra Singh Panwar, he also cut his teeth in student politics, and then he went on to be deputy mayor of Shimla. And he's now he's a policy thinker. He writes policy-oriented articles, especially the Hindu. We welcome all the three. Maybe we can start with Vishy Iyer. Vishy, go ahead. Tell us, when they sit down and make the budget, where does education come in? Just give us a run through and then give your take on this topic.
Yeah. So thank you, Kalyana Ramanji. So I would say before I get into specifics, just a couple of sentences. I started my career as a chartered accountant and later did my PhD in finance. And I would say for the past 20 years, been a professor in the area of finance and accounting across multiple business schools in India. Right? Why I'm stating it upfront so that you know where certain perspectives are coming from. Okay, and it is also possible that certain things that I see as a concern may not be seen as a concern by probably other professionals. Right? So just stating my perspective in place. Now, coming to this point, this is a very important point to discuss. When we look at budget, we generally say about 2.9%, right? So if you look at the overall GDP, about 2.9 to 3% of the overall GDP is what we spend in education, right? But this is both the union as well as the state budgets put together. In fact, a large portion of it comes from the state budgets, and I would say about roughly 3/4 comes from the state, and 1/4 comes from the central allocated funds. Right. So in rupee terms, it's roughly about 9.5 lakh crores. Right, and in today's terms, if we talk about it, it will be close to about 120 US billion dollars. Now, the amount is good, decent, I would say. Two things. One is when we compare it with other nations, should it be about this number of about 3%? No, it should be at least close to 5%, if not close to 6%. That's one. Second, even within the existing spending, let me wear the CA hat. Even within this existing spending, a large portion goes into OPEX. And a large portion of this amount still goes into administrative and salary expenses, right? So as the discussion progresses further and as we hear from other panel members, we can look into, right, where the allocation happens, what can be done better. The short answer is yes, we have come a long way. As Kalyana Ramanji correctly said, we have come a long way compared to where we were over the past 7 decades. But today, we need to look at a little bit more carefully, how are we going to allocate these resources, what more we need, where are we going to allocate these resources in higher education, what do we need to do on research and productivity front. And at some point, I'll also talk about, within the realm of higher education, why we need to focus on management education. See, we have big goals, Viksit Bharat goals, right? Over the next 20 years, what is that we want to achieve? So where does this funding fits in? We'd also look at what have some other nations have done, right? We always have a good example of, I would not say good, but there are some good things that we can look at what China has managed to achieve over the past 20-25 years. I wouldn't say we should exactly copy that, right? So as we progress, we deep dive into these matters. So the big picture, yes, currently from the budget, we do spend, we do have overall state plus center all put together close to 2.9% of GDP allocated, right? So over to you, Kalyana Ramanji.
Okay, thanks, Vishy. We will come back to you later on with some follow-up questions and also the audience questions. I ask Abhishek to weigh in. Tell us, Abhishek, what will the finance minister, this budget, what will her priorities be if education will be a priority? It will certainly be a priority, as they will say. But what do you think will happen? Will we see a massive increase in investment in education?
Thank you, Kalyan Raman sir. I'm sure we all are waiting to see a massive increase in budgetary allocation for education, and I would say I'm particularly hoping that we see a substantial rise in higher education funding this time. As we were discussing, as you'd also mentioned, how the process of finalizing this budget goes. So the budgetary consultations, they started almost 2 3 months back, and all these sectors, there are several groups that are made. There are groups for defense, groups for education, for industry, and there are people who are coming from industry, from NGOs, from different think tanks, and there are meetings and talks about what should be the changes in the budget this time for that particular sector. So if you I've got an opportunity to be a part of a couple of meetings this year as well as last year, and there is no group, there is no stakeholder that says that we do not need a substantial increase. So there is every sector that is hoping that there will be a substantial increase in budget. Every group, every stakeholder has their own demands. But if we look at it from the point of view of the government, the pie is fixed. You can only increase the budget with, you have a lot of constraints already when you start deciding about your allocations. So although we all want that there should be a substantial increase, but there are challenges. Leaving that aside, what I would rather hope for is that in the budget that we see next week, I hope that we finally see a massive increase in budget, especially for higher education, because I think that is one field where we are lagging behind, far behind, I would say. We whenever we talk about education budget, as you also mentioned about 6% of GDP six decades, we have to talk about reaching the same target which we had decided back in 1960s. When we had the National Education Policy in 1986, again they had focused on 6%. The National Education Policy of 2020 again says that we'll reach 6%. But God knows when we'll reach 6% of education. But even in whatever funds are allocated, I think we've heavily focused our funding towards primary education. I do agree that in the initial years that is what was required, but I think now time has come where we also start focusing more on higher education. And why I say that particularly is because if you see the reports that have come, even if you see the report by Ministry of Education in 24-25, there have been surveys done by independent NGOs, and all of them have said that more or less, if we talk about, say, gross enrollment ratio, if you talk about pupil teacher ratio, we are close to meeting the targets, and some reports even are too positive that we have already met the targets for primary education. So if that is the case, I think it's time that we also focus on higher education, because what I feel is that the issue in primary education is not of allocation but of implementation. We've been allocating sufficient amount of fund for primary education for a very long time, and it is time that we focus more on the implementation part of it, because that is where the problem actually lies in primary education. And if you look at higher education, the gross enrollment ratio is hardly, say, 28%, and we aim that our gross enrollment ratio in higher education will be 50% by 2035. That is what our NEP 2020 says. So if that is the case, if we are actually very serious about higher education, I think, I hope, in fact, last year as well, after the budget, I had written an article saying that it's a complete disappointment for higher education. When we talk about research and development, we are spending, say, about 0.6% or 0.7% of the GDP on research and development. And as Dr. Iyer had mentioned about China, if we have to learn from them, they're investing 2.4% of their GDP on research and development. The European countries have been investing over 2%. US is investing over 3%. South Korea and Israel invest over 4%. And we are still investing only 0.6% to 0.7%. And research and development is ultimately going to form the basis for all your sectors. So I think it is high time that we focus on research and development. And also, one thing that I'm actually looking for is, I hope that there is something significant for revival of state universities too, because we have amazing state universities. We have seen their contribution over last 7-8 decades, but I think they have been completely ignored. We have almost 500 state universities, but their condition is only going down. So it is time that we focus on such institutes. We make use of them. We judicially use their capacity, and I think that is something that I would really like to see in the budget next week. Yeah. So
Excellent. Thanks, Abhishek. Thanks for pointing out that we've had this aspirational goal of 6% for forever. Like 6 decades, we've had that. We've never really gotten to do it. If not now, when? I mean, there is this point that every sector wants a boost, wants a, but education in the way it is, and especially now with India where it is, I, it may well be time to do it. And it's a good point that you brought in regarding state universities. I mean, most of 85% of the expense is with the state governments. The center only has a small part of this whole pie regarding managing and running education institutions are concerned. But it's a good point, fair point, that state universities have seen a considerable decline in the last 20 years or more. There was this judgment recently, the Supreme Court suddenly they issued a order saying better fill up all the vacancies in 4 months. I don't know if that timeline is practical, but it just goes to show, because when you do anecdotal reportage, what we hear is that 50% of faculty posts are vacant. And the court, mind you, was looking at suicide and mental health, and instead they chose to focus on this also. They said academic distress is also very important, and they said fill up all the posts, all vice chancellors, registrars, and in universities, and get down to this in 4 months. That was the order it was given recently. And thanks for pointing that out. I will ask Tikender to weigh in. Tikender, tell us what is your take on this issue.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Kalyan Ramanji. And well, I have no difference of opinion from both my predecessors, Dr. Abhishek and Dr. Vishwanathan Iyer. But the point, and allow me to be a little generic here, the point that I want to make here is, why are we not able to reach to that level? And what are the changes that have happened in the last couple of decades? So let me just set this in perhaps 2 or 3 phases, Kalyan Ramanji. Give me just 10 minutes. I think I should be able to finish off in 10 to 12 minutes.
Go ahead.
Right at the inception, I think what I would like to say is that it's a constitutional promise, education for everyone as a right. But now I think it's a transition from what I call, from a constitutional promise to a market commodity. Unfortunately, we should not leave this nuanced approach, and that's where I would like to come at the end. So and when we were formed a republic, how are we imagining education? How are we imagining education now, Kalyan Ramanji? And all this comes from not just the ideological moorings that the background that I come from, but also being a very strong student activist for almost a decade, in the decade of 90s and 2000s. And when I was witnessing this transition taking place from what in my term and perhaps in your generation, where we always imagined education as a right, and I do not remember paying more than 200 rupees as a fee throughout the year, whereas now in the same college, the hostel fees, I mean, it's a government college I'm talking about, is the hostel fees is more than 1.5 lakh. So I mean, I'll come to that. I mean, why that's happening. So it was never imagined as an investment opportunity, and it was imagined as an ethical foundation of democracy. I think those are the roots that I would like to go back. And even in the Constituent Assembly, if you see the debate that has taken place in the education sector, maybe we didn't very demarcate it as a right, but of course a duty and a public responsibility. I quote unquote, it was a public responsibility. And that is why education entered, our constitutional imagination. Finally, under Article 21, of course, 2045 and all. So this matters. Why I'll say this matters? Because from the very beginning, education was never meant to be governed by market logic. And yet today, as we approach the union budget, that's going to happen, maybe 7 days from now or less than that, February 1, we must ask a disturbing question. At what point did education stop being the Republic's responsibility and start becoming the market's playground? And the second point that I want to make here is, and of course we know the commissions, correct me if I'm wrong, the Radhakrishnan Commission, and then the famous Kothari Commission in the 64 and 66, and of which Dr. Abhishek has made a reference, and Dr. Vishwanathan also, that, I mean, we used to quote nine is mine. Now, and nine is mine. Nine was of the budget, but almost 6% of the GDP should be spent on education. Education as a common school system, and all this I'm quoting from the Kotahari Commission. And then education as a tool for social transformation. Education funded primarily by the state. I just reiterate again, funded primarily by the state. And the historical recommendation, of course, 6%. I mean, you started from there. We still are haunting a figure close to that. And this is not an arbitrary number, but I think it was derived from teacher requirement. There's a scientific basis, school infrastructure, enrollment, etc., etc. 6 decades down the line, and we are still not there. Post-Kotahari drift also, we've seen how expansion took place. And you also rightly pointed out, but I would say expansion without commitment. And more schools, more universities, more students, but funding never matched that expansion. Then by late 1980s, if you ask me, education spending hovered somewhere around 3.5%. Vishwanathan ji just gave us a figure where we are exactly now. And we've also seen how regional and class inequalities widened in our society, and how that has also affected the larger ambit of education. Private schooling began to creep in quietly. Of course, not schooling, but also at the university level. And I'll share a very funny anecdote here, Kalyan and Sab. So come the 1991 economic reforms, and with them a philosophical rupture. And that's the point that I want to make here. And this was when capital entered the classroom. And what does it mean? I mean, what we call the neoliberal framework post-90s. And I am a kind of transition to that, because I joined education prior to that, and then I was closely witnessing this transition taking place. Changed it, and the transition, the education policy, and this is what we were discussing yesterday, Dr. Abhishek and myself. Perhaps I'm a hybrid, and he is a product of post, neoliberal framework that, and of course, being a student activist, I'm so glad that he wrote an article last year sharing that 6%, nothing less than 6% of GDP is what we are looking at. So, and what were the words? I mean, what are the words still haunting us in the education sector? Even in the budgetary speech, efficiency, cost sharing, this was never heard in my times. Public-private ownership, my God, this was never, ever. And I'll tell you a funny anecdote. User charges on education. Now, let me share a very funny anecdote, because I come from a university campus which was not just politically very surcharged, but unlike other universities, if you to do any form of shift in the processes of teaching, or in fee structure, then you could not bypass the students' union. So, and I remember when seats were being privatized, and this happened in the management sector. And I remember the then Vice Chancellor, Professor H.P. Dixit. I mean, he later became the Vice Chancellor of IGNOU. And he said, Tikendra, what do you want? We said, we do not want a single paisa to be increased on fees. He said, what if I give you an alternative? Now look, hear this alternative. There's a very funny thing that happened. And we also, I wouldn't say we succumbed, but we also agreed to that alternative. He said, how many seats you have in the MBA? I think at that time we had some 40 seats in our master's course. He said, I give you 60 seats in master's, again free of cost, but allow me 40 more, what was called the NRI quota. So this privatization in the higher education started through an NRI quota. No NRI was supposed to come. It was all meant to get a certificate from outside. And that's how, 40 seats were kind of privatized in my campus, to which I was also, I make that submission here. I was also a party to it, because we got 20 more seats, 20 or 30 more seats. And this is happening in a campus that was not allowing a single paisa increase. Can you believe that? So imagine what was happening across the country. And we have seen the fallout of that. And then we have, of course, the Yashpal committee, which warned against this trend, cautioning that education was being reduced to some kind of information delivery and credentialism. But unfortunately, the warning went unheeded. And by 2010, if you ask me, private schools dominated urban India. They continue to dominate. Higher education is increasingly relied on fees and loans. And I fully endorse what Dr. Abhishek is mentioning here, that R&D is not even being discussed. And no, we cannot even imagine being a state a Viksit Bharat state which has to be self-reliant if we do not invest on research and development. And the state began retreating, not loudly, I would say, but decisively. And then comes the NEP. You want me to speak about NEP now and the budget, or you want a second round, Kalyana Ramanji? Else I'll finish the NEP and the budget, process. What do you suggest?
Yes, go right ahead. Go
Go
ahead.
right. Okay, thank you. And then comes the National Education Policy 2020. Actually, it's a misnomer. It did not invent privatization. According to me, it legitimized it. And when I say legitimized it, what does it mean? So, look at the language of the NEP, the language of flexibility and interdisciplinarity. NEP quietly introduced, institutional kind of autonomy. So, yeah, you have autonomous institutions, but without financial autonomy. So, what does it mean? And if you ask, I'll give you examples. What does that mean about financial autonomy? Just leaving user fees, user charges doesn't mean, and kind of straight jacketing from the top. So multiple exit options, which meant normalizing the dropouts. And there's a huge labor market that was required. So, quite linkage to the market shift that started taking place quite early. And loan-based funding models, the HIFA model. Now, come on, if you look at the HIFA model, it is considered to be a great, I would say it is a great leap backwards. Why? Because linking with market and producing is what I call, instead of organic intellectuals, we were commoditizing products serving the market. So there's a new kind of transition that witnessed that did not happen in my time, that where I was a transition. And of course, user fee. So, education being supported through loans and to be institutionalized and operationalized. And this is quite normative now. If I tell my children now that, look, in my time, we didn't even imagine of loans on education because it was a right. And this is what I have always been complaining, the Washington consensus, and since now I'm no more into, this sector of education and arguing for, like Dr. Abhishek and all are doing. I'm more into cities, but I find a similar framework in the cities. In the cities, I always say whether water is a right or a need. Then most of the people say in the current generation, it's a need. The moment you say it's a need, Kalyan Ramanji, then you have distilleries and all sorts of companies to provide. But the moment you say water, which means that you accrue this right from the state. And currently, if you ask the current generation whether education is a need or a right, I would say 90% would say it's a need. If it is a need, then there are many market forces. And that's what we are witnessing. This is a complete new normative that has been created in the last couple of decades. And and this I copy from one of the great philosophers, of course, economist, who says that, this model prepares students not as citizens, unfortunately, but as market-ready labor units. This is not the role and not the job. So what needs to be done? I do not know. I think completely inverse the model. So, and then I go to my favorite term, what I call, where the use value gets converted into exchange value. Give me 1 minute just to explain what does it mean. This is a political economy concept, but for our listeners, for our participants, let me for example, what is a use value? Exchange value means things that gets commoditized. Education has a use value. Why? Because to me, if education has a use value, it develops critical thinking. There is democratic participation. If I tell anyone that, look, in the academic council, the students used to decide the syllabus. Now you can't even imagine that. So there's no democratic participation. Whole question of social mobility and whole question of human flourishing. But contemporary, if you see policy and budgets, education is increasingly judged by its exchange value, which means what? Placement statistics, salary packages. Pick up a newspaper and they will tell you the student studying from one institution got a package of 50 lakhs, 1 crore rupees. And I just came back from Bangalore, and they were also cribbing about the same thing. And then after 10 years, 15 years serving, they come to mountains to my place and then book tickets because they say we are fed up of this system. So what are we producing? Are they organic intellectuals or just market slaves? So complete industry alignment, market relevance. When this happens, what does it mean? Education becomes a commodity and a private investment and a site of capital accumulation. That's where I want to end this point. Actually, if you see, what are the processes through which we have learned in economics, capital accumulation takes place? We have always learned it's through production process. Here's a new reproduction process in the system, where education is contributing phenomenally for capital accumulation. Look at a state like Kerala, where just the NEET coaching classes accumulate somewhere around 1000 CR. That is the market. So imagine huge kind of shift that is taking place. And of course, this is not accidental, but this is, I would say, budget driven. So if you have to ask me where the union budget actually goes, I mean, the numbers, I think Dr. Abhishek and Vishwanathan are the best people to tell you. But look at the numbers that have gone. Union budget, of course, 1.29 lakh crore. It does sound great, but at the same time, if you see, it's not even 2.7 and 2.9%. And roughly 60% goes to school education, 65%, and 35% to the higher education. And then universities are pushed towards fee hikes, self finances. So the adult, to me, I think the last point that I want to make, the ideological pattern becomes clear, Kalyan Ramanji. The state reduces direct funding, encourages private participation, promotes loan based education, and measures success through market outcomes. This is not fiscal compulsion. This is an ideological choice, to be very frank. And unfortunately, we are discussing budget 2026 in this given framework. And look at the other countries. Have they shown alternatives? Dr. Abhishek was very steadfast to point. China spends almost 4% of the GDP, OECD 5 to 6%. They fund teachers, research, and public institutions. And India, with the demography, I think you were pointing out, population, the demographic dividend, and deeper inequalities, we spend around 3%, less than 3%. So what the budget must do, finally, I mean, if you ask me just 5, 7 quick points, I think first thing is 6% straight away jump, time bound funding commitment, rebuild school education. And I remember we were a great critique of the, in my student activist days, what we call the Jawahar Navodaya Vidyalaya, the JNVs. But look at the change that they have brought. I mean, I can count on my fingertips the phenomenal, transition it has brought in the countryside. I mean, families who would have never imagined to send their children to the school have produced some of the finest bureaucrats, some of the finest. So that whole question of bringing. So I think we have to reimagine that stuff. I mean, if there's huge social inequality that exists, so rebuild school education. When I say massive teacher recruitment, infrastructure, you already rightly pointed out, and of course, universal secondary education, restore UGC funding for higher education, research and development, what was said by Dr. Abhishek. Then whole question of reclaiming the education's use value, which means fund humanities and social sciences, for heaven's sake. Do not leave it to be funded by someone else. I mean, these are some of the important elements. And democratize funding, which means include teachers, students, and states in the planning process. I do not find such a process. That imagination is completely gone. All that is happening is if a university has to get a fund, a grade, and it's so obnoxious to get part of that grading system. I think Dr. Abhishek would be able to tell more on that. I'm no more into, or maybe Dr. Vishwanath, but it's literally obnoxious the way the grading is being done. I think that doesn't allow this universities to bloom, prosper, and develop with critical thinking, and of course, providing academic autonomy from what I call the corporate capture that is there, and of course, democratize budgeting, which means end conditional federal funding, what I just mentioned. So lastly, and that's where I want to finish off, is budget is not about numbers, Kalyan Ramanji. I think education remains a constitutional promise, and I reiterate that. Uh, it should not become a market commodity. Now, that's a choice that we have to make, and that's where I find complete inversal that has to be seen. So, will students be treated as citizens in the making or as human capital for accumulation? I think I go by the first one. Students should be treated as citizens in the making because they are the future, not just some elements of capital accumulation. And if education is to be reduced to exchange value alone, then democracy itself is impoverished. I think it's not charity that we are asking for 2026, not as investment, but as a right, a responsibility, and last, where I started from, a public good. And this is the demand of our time. I think I've exhausted my time, everything. Thank you so much for providing this opportunity. Kalyan Raman.
Thanks, Tikender. I will Okay, we had some audio issues. Anyway, we've corrected that. I will ask. It's a very. He was asking fundamental questions. He sort of quit the pitch, so to speak, and sort of backtracked, walked back, and these are important things. I remember paying 6,000. I studied at one of the first private engineering colleges, and I paid 6,000 rupees semester fees. Even if you adjust to inflation now, the actual fees paid in a similar institution is many times more. We're just paying far more for education. Is that a good thing at all? Should we walk back on that? It's a very fundamental question he asked, and the fact that we use language like investment, productivity, and he's saying that's not what education is. There's a higher moral goal, and so on. But let me ask. I would ask Abhishek and Vishy, both economists, and about this whole trend, how education has changed. He talked much about how education is a very important source of capital accumulation, which is not typically how it's seen in other countries. Oil, resources, that's where capital accumulates, but here education seems to be a big source of capital accumulation. Is that a wrong thing, or is that, how do you see it? I would love to hear you. I'm sure audience will also love to hear you weigh in on that. Go ahead, Vishy, or perhaps Abhishek.
Okay.
Both, actually.
So, thank you. The thing is, okay, now let me frame it a little differently. Do I agree with the assertion by Tikenderji? The thing is, we have to look at the entire education from the lens of what is a public good here, what is a private good here. The thing that is public good should be funded by the government. The thing that is a private good, the private investment has to kick in, right? So we need to make a certain kind of nuanced position on how do we approach it. See, I come from a generation where I have seen transition from a time when in the early 80s we were waiting for our it took 2 years for us to get gas cylinders, and bread was still being produced by the government. Only one kind of bread was available, and that was being produced by the government. Today it's a very different world, right? Now, see, certain the details are in the nuances. As we often say, the devil is always in the details. When it comes to public good, what do I mean by public good here? It is the state's responsibility to ensure or help create a pipeline of well-trained faculty, invest in research, right? So that's what I would call, and fund extensively primary education. So these are some things that the state has to absolutely do it in one form or the other. But when it comes to, let's say, higher education, let's say, management or technology, design, or, many of these applied professional education, it can be privatized. So there is no problem in those education being privatized, because there is a need for private capital. You can't expect a growing economy like India to bring in resources. There are a lot of competing demands on resources. So there is only so much that a government can fund it, right? We want the money, but my concern is more from the point of view of, we need to increase the budgetary allocation, but those budgetary allocation has to go for what I call, or what we understand as, public good, right? So what should the approach be? The core areas of research, we are not funding at all. We really lag behind. At one point in time, probably around 2000, I keep comparing China because it's unfair to compare with other countries, because the sheer size of us. We can't compare it to a Germany or a Singapore or a Japan, because we are so many times more, right? So China offers a fair comparison in terms of size and how did they manage the scale problem. Of course, there is a problem of absolute centralization and the challenges associated with it. Back in 2000, the kind of quality of research that was coming out of China was comparable to that of India, and it was very abysmal, right? Now, we have made progress since then. But when I look at China, the kind of research that happens, whether it is in technology, whether it is management, applied areas, has been phenomenal. And today they compare with the United States in terms of the output, right? So that's what we need to look at. What can be done? This is where outcome orientation is needed. Currently, when we look at, and I'm not even getting into primary education, right? So that's a big problem, and Tikendraji rightly said that's a big problem that needs to be fixed in a very different way. I'm looking at higher education and specifically research. Unless we have long-term committed funding instead of sporadic short-term research grants being made available, long-term dedicated funding, looking at outcomes, where we hold the institutions responsible or the grantees responsible for research output, we cannot make progress, right? So unless we take some tough stand there, we would not see knowledge creation happening. And why that is so fundamental? See, education has two parts at a very, very, I'd say at a 30,000 feet level. There is a knowledge creation part of it, and there is a knowledge transmission part of it. Probably in the transmission part, digital technologies and other private players can come in. But in the knowledge creation part, unless we take responsibility, what would happen? We would tend to rely on the American European models, the American European learnings, whatever their knowledge system has created, and we take that as a basis, and we try to kind of apply in an Indian context. Now, and this in the long run creates a lot of disaster. Whether it is, I would say, managing of the economy, right? What banks should do. This is where there's a difference between when you import somebody coming from the US or IMF as our head of RBI. The worldview is very different. We have a lot of internal dynamics. Indian problems are different, and Indian problems need, I would say, Indian solutions, right? And that would not come by merely copying some of the models from the West. So unless we commit resource and we engage in research across, whether it is technology, whether it is management, policy, humanities, we would end up copying them, and we would end up creating a mess of the way we do things, right? So, and I feel very passionately about this. I've been in academic space. I moved on, and it's been 20 years plus, right? And I see this, that unless we get that right, even in these areas, management, which is a productivity multiplier, right? Even in these areas, we need to have our own benchmark. So I would position my stand here. I would love to hear what Abhishek has to say on this matter.
Thank you, sir. I think you've covered the majority of the points, and you've very clearly explained about the difference between public and private good. Now, if I'll just what I would do is I would talk about primary and secondary, the higher education separately. So, if we talk about primary education, in primary education, if I say see it in Delhi, where I am based, what I see in my colleagues that we are not even talking about sending our kids to government schools. Even if there is a government school available in our area, we all want to send our kids to private schools, and in that also there is a competition that we send it to a bigger school. Now, why is it happening? Because when you're sending your kid to a school, when you're starting their education, you want to build a strong foundation. Now, if we are completely ignoring a government school despite it being available completely on the basis of what we are teaching, then it is not about availability of that good, but more to do with what is its capacity or what is it offering. So as I said earlier as well, that what I think has to be done now is that rather than focusing on the allocation part of primary education, I'm not saying that we should reduce allocation, but all I'm saying is rather than increasing it further, it's time that we stop here and check the implementation and systems in place before we expand our allocation for primary sector now. So that is what I would say for primary. And as far as higher education is concerned, we all have already pointed out that there is a need for increasing the higher education. Now, when the private sector comes in, I think in higher education, as we've seen, if we look at developed countries as well, private universities, as well as the interference or collaboration of corporates and private sector with the top tier universities is too high. Now, but when we look at India, we what do we see in terms of industry academia collaboration? We've seen a lot of people talking about it. I think NEP 2020 also talks about industry academia collaboration. But then what is the roadmap? How do we do that collaboration? What is going to be the extent to which the industry is involved in academia? How will it be involved? What are the students going to gain out of it? How are we going to improve our quality out of it? That is something that is not being discussed the way it should be. We are talking about these concepts on paper. Now we talk about say if we need money for higher education. I'll just give you a very small example. I think that we have money, but if we use it judicially, a lot of things can come out of it. And the example that I was referring to is UP government. UP government gave a project of almost, I think, if I'm not wrong, you will correct me if I'm wrong, of 1,000 crores to Deloitte to make a plan of how UP can become a $1 trillion economy. Okay, no problem in making a plan. But all I'm saying is that rather than giving those 100 crores to Deloitte, if you had given 2 crores to 5 top universities of UP, what don't you think there could have been difference? You have IIT Kanpur, you have IIM Lucknow, you have a BHU, you have an Allahabad University, you have top tier institutes in your own state. If you would have given 2 crores each to those 5, it would have been done in 10% of the cost. And I can assure you, I've read the report that Deloitte has prepared. I can assure you that had you trusted your own institutions, had you trusted your own faculty, had you given an opportunity to your young researchers, you would have got a much better output. So it is about how we use our funds, and the money is available. Tikendraji has also mentioned about HEFA loans. Now there are a lot of things that are involved in HEFA loans, because it is not, we see it as a loan because you're getting the money upfront and it has to be returned. But if you see, if a central university is applying for a HEFA loan, technically it does not have to repay anything. It is repaid by the central government. There is only, I think, 10% of the principal that has to be paid or something like that. And if there are some new universities that are coming up, for that, the principal as well as interest is completely waived off. So it is more like a grant. So there are a lot of complexities, although it is referred as a loan, but that is not really a loan, I would say. So all I'm trying to say is, whether it be industry academia collaboration, or about diverting funds, the consultancy example that I gave, or managing funds between the primary and the higher education, I think a lot of things can be done if we actually want to increase funding for higher education. And I would go on to the extent of saying that if you actually want to increase your spending for higher education, you may do it by borrowing. There is no harm in that. Let fiscal deficit go up by 0.5 or 1%. You don't have to be too conservative when it's about building the foundation of your country. You can increase your fiscal deficit. There was I was a part of Ministry of Finance back in 2021, and if you see the economic survey of 2020-21, there is a chapter that talks about debt sustainability, and it says that if your growth is higher than your debt, there is no harm in borrowing more. And if you can fund your fiscal deficit by getting higher growth, there is no harm in it. So if we are talking about increasing funding for education, for research, I think there is no harm if we have to borrow it, even if our fiscal deficit target is not met. We are, I think the fiscal deficit as of now is around 4.4, 4.5%. Even if it goes up to 5.5%, I think there is no harm if we are using that money judicially for improving our higher education and research and development.
Thanks, Abhishek, for this important point that, especially if it comes to education, deficits shouldn't matter. I now field a question from Nirmal Godara. He's asking, is the government
Kalyanan, can I just make one quick point?
Go ahead.
Well, I'm extremely elated and so happy to hear Dr. Abhishek, especially, and of course, both Dr. Vishwanath and Dr. Abhishek for, presenting actually what I wanted to say. And thank you, Abhishek, for making those comments. But let me share an anecdote, because, movement throws so many anecdotes, and here's another one to come. So when I was serving as the deputy mayor, Kalyan Ramanji, and I'll tell you why I'm sharing this anecdote. My chief minister, the then chief minister, Mr. Veerbhadra Singh, and I'm also to state here that we are next to Kerala in the Human Development Index, without major industries, being one of the most backward states in the country when we got independence, and even when we, in fact, tomorrow we'll be observing and celebrating our full statehood when we got statehood in 1971. So in a short gap of 15, 20 years, we were able to match, Kerala, which has a long history of social reforms, etc. And we are next to Kerala. What was the trick? How did this happen? And that's why I'm so happy to hear Dr. Abhishek's point. I mean, why it is so important to just come out of this paranoia of, fiscal deficit and invest on the education sector. Now, the anecdote is this, that the chief minister, my MLA, who was from another party. So we three different parties were sitting together, and the local MLA made some comment, and he made a comment in the context of Himachal, saying that it's high time that Himachal has actually expanded. Now it's time to consolidate. Now, I don't know how many of you, but some of the friends who are there in Delhi know that most of the time my chief minister used to doze off. Yeah, of course, because of his age, but he never dozed off. He used to hear things while keeping his eyes. And he asked me, "Did he say something about expansion?" I said, "Yes, sir." He said something. He said, "Okay, let me just counter it." And then he gave the figure. He said he doesn't know what Himachal is. I have traveled all across the state, and that's how I can tell you that why still expansion in the education sector, particularly in higher education, is required. Now, how do I substantiate it? 4 months, 5 months down the line, and I met one of my, student activist leaders, and he became a principal of a college in Solan district. That's in Solan district in Dharampur. And I asked him, "How is your college doing? How is it going?" He said, "Together, I can tell you from the clothes of the. There are some 850 students, by the way, and out of 850, there are 650 women, girls students, and I can tell you by their clothes, the clothes that they wear. Had it been some 15 kilometers away from this place, they wouldn't have afforded to reach there. Now, what does it mean? Just patiently think about that. Because of this expansion, because of and we have this, free education for girls till some time back. So once you educate a woman and a girl child, a family gets stabilized. It's a whole question of economic unit that I'm talking about. It's a whole question of equity that I'm talking about. And this is quite related to the education sector. So I'm so happy that, Dr. Abhishek pointed this out. And of course, yes, why shouldn't people be going to government schools? Kerala, we find it quite inverse. The ministers' children, bureaucrats' children, they're entering, their problem is at the higher education. But students are entering at the school education. Finally, the third point that I want to make is, for heaven's sake, bring in. I mean, I'm so magnificently he brought out, the whole question of Deloitte and all. But why cannot we just call all the NIT and IITs and IITs and call them and just hear them out? How are they looking at this transitory phase? What is it that they want? What is that they need? Do not just superimpose this whole, uh, uh, framework of ideas that we find in different forms. I think that will give a great leap in really creating and recreating the creativity of these institutions. But thank you, Dr. Abhishek. Yeah, thank you so much.
Interesting point. Himachal does stand out. If you look at indices, development indices, and you will see southern states somewhere in the top of the table, and among the northern states, Himachal will stand out for various things: literacy, higher education, education of women, and so on, infant mortality. So there's one state that, and thanks for pointing out that it is education in the recent last 4 or 5 decades that has helped to push the state up. Thanks for the interesting point to be noted. I will read out this question. Is the government considering the creation of a detailed and substantial? It's something Abhishek pointed out, and the recent Supreme Court judgment, or it was on a different, it was hearing a different matter, but it just took up a whole plethora of issues in higher education. So the creation of a dedicated and substantial fund for higher education and research in the coming years to retain talent and strengthen India's research ecosystem. If Abhishek knows what's the finance minister thinking, perhaps he can enlighten us. Or should it? Anyone can take this question. Abhishek? Abhishek, do you hear me?
About creating a dedicated and substantial fund for higher education and research. I am not sure if a dedicated and substantial fund for higher education is being created. We are talking about NEP, we are talking about National Research, the NRF, and I hope that social science and humanities also soon becomes a part of it. We have all of those, but I am not sure if a dedicated fund is being created around it.
So you don't think there is, I mean, yes, sir, go ahead.
No, so there are a lot of research grants being set up, correct? I wouldn't deny that. There are a lot of research grants being given. But my concern there is, those research grants are not being targeted properly. It is like a scattergun approach. Money is being given for smaller projects spread across, right? There is no larger thinking of how do you want to, set the agenda, have a higher goal. See, even when it comes to this matter of research, we have to be very honest when we compare the schools across the country, right? Unfortunately, many of the private institutions, including many, there are about 3,000 schools in India, which is in MBA, right, in the MBA space. Large number of them, when you look at it, what is the kind of research that is happening, whether it is with the government support or whether it is self-financed, whatever be the nature of it, right? Unfortunately, a large output of this research is going into substandard journals, very low quality journals, very ordinary output. So, so unless we fix that problem, more money being given, it's like if a pot has holes, pouring more money into the pot, pouring more water into the pot is not going to help. It'll only leak out, right? So unless we have a different kind of expectations and benchmarks for research, giving more money to schools which are not focusing properly on research is going to be counterproductive. That's one. And also the scattergun approach of, giving a little bit here, little bit there, this scheme, that scheme, this policy, some 10 research projects under Indian knowledge systems, some 15 projects under this, some 20. It's not helping. We need a larger dedicated, approach to this.
Just to add to this point about the issues with the system, as you were saying, there's no point of adding money to the pot if it has holes. There are two things in this. First, about all these organizations, the research organizations, whether it be ICSSR, ICCR, ICMR, ICAR, all of these, their fundings has anyways reduced. And on top of that, it is very shocking to see that we're talking that there should be more allocations to all of these organizations, higher education. But it's shocking to see that majority of these schemes are unable to utilize the entire amount by the end of the year and the money is returned. So when you raise a demand with the Ministry of Finance saying that we need higher allocation, they have a very simple answer saying that you could not use the amount that we had sanctioned last year. So that is also a very serious concern, that the entire amount, when it is allocated, because the entire process is so complicated, the way system runs, there is so many hurdles, they're not even spending the amount that is sanctioned, and it is returned back in the end by the end of the year. And then the next year, when you ask for a hike, they say that you've not spent what you were allotted last year, so there is no need for a hike. So that is also a serious issue here.
Okay. Ankita Biswas, she's saying, she's echoing Tikinder, as I believe education is a fundamental right. I'm disappointed to see the budget hasn't addressed the issue of skyrocketing fees. How can we achieve inclusive growth if education is a luxury? Prioritizing education funding would empower India's youth and drive long-term progress. The truth is that state governments are sort of pulling back on funding their of their universities, their colleges that they run. Has the union government said, you can take loans, that's about it, and we give grants for research. But besides that, to really keep institutions running, have robust faculty, grow them, shouldn't it intervene or sort of help higher education that is still the purview of state governments? What do you think? Does anyone want to take it up?
Oh, okay, I'll start. See, again, we have to look at the fundamental problem here, at least from my lens, the way I see it. See, unless, and this is where I'm building on what Abhishek just now said, right? Unless you you have a foundation where people are trained to do high quality research, uh, it's not going to solve for itself. The problem is not going to solve for itself, right? So there are ways of achieving it. Okay, and we need to take responsibility for. So there has to be a mechanism whereby, again, if I look at China as an example, what did they do given the scale, and particularly research in technology management, these areas, right? How they have significantly revamped it. So one is very targeted. First of all, a large pool of fund, committed, dedicated pool of fund for research. Within that, collaboration with institutions, higher educational institutions from US, particularly US, Europe, clear mandate of outcomes, and that's when, over a period of time, and then a large number of students were encouraged to do PhD outside, and then they were brought back. Some of the big names were brought back to China, and that's how slowly the research culture became strong over a period of time. So that has to happen at a fundamental level. Now, coming to state, what is happening is each state is looking at it from its lens. There is a lot that can be achieved. I'm not going at primary education, I'm talking of higher education. A lot that can be achieved when there is a pooling of resources, and there is a kind of understanding on benchmarks of quality of research. This is where I'll tie it back to regulatory problems. If I come to NIRF rankings, yes, there is a significant portion that looks at 30% of the overall ranking is for looking at research. But what do we look there for research? Whether it is a college, like a good college, like where university, or a standalone MBA institution like I come from, across the spectrum. They again go by a certain output, Scopus indexed output. Now, there's again a problem. There are large number of journals there, very poor quality journals there. And so even though you are looking at research, you are kind of encouraging institutions across the country to do mediocre research and get more numbers, publish more mediocre papers. Thankfully, some of the private institutions, business schools and IIMs, again, I'm talking from the point of view of management education, they decide to focus on, whether we take some of the IIMs like Udaipur or Bangalore, or some of the private schools like us or XLRI, right? So what we do, we look at, not targeting at numbers, but look at top quality journals and target those journals. Now, that's when you improve the scholarship of the place, right? Overall scholarship of the place. So this problem has to be looked at a little bit more carefully in terms of, we don't want, see, the government had right ideas. They felt that NIRF should give 30% weightage for research. But what has happened over the last 5 to 7 years, unfortunately, it has now become a, everybody is doing research, but what is the research that they're doing? Pick up something from somewhere, do it something for, I would apply it for some village or something or some sector in India, and then publish it in some random journal, which is a Scopus index journal, right? So that's where a well-intended thought brought in through regulation, an example of this, ends up becoming counterproductive. Same thing goes for accreditation, right? When we look at accreditation of institutions, accreditation of higher educational institutions, the same problem comes in. What are we looking for? I'm a director for accreditation and ranking here, and I've been doing this for the last 8 years across a couple of top business schools in India. When you compare how American, European accreditation bodies look at accreditation versus we look at accreditation in India, big difference. Again, focus on here, the focus is on some quantity, some numbers that can be easily measured, right? We are not looking at the quality. So I mean, there's a lot that I can speak on this front, but I would hold my points here. So that's my big picture observation here. Back to you, Kalyan Ramanji.
Can I make a comment here? Can I make a
Go
comment?
ahead. Go ahead, please.
Okay, so this is quite an interesting question. Now, let me place it in little perspective. When we got independence, how did we imagine to build ourselves? There's this Kalyan Ramanji famous Bombay plan. I'm sure every one of us have heard about this Bombay plan, which meant that we required a relatively self-reliant developmental process. And if our people are dying because of hunger, and if we do not have even the bare minimum steel to produce, so I think the two major elements, one in the industrial production process, where we require steel production, and the second one in agriculture production, where we get self-sufficiency. So education to me is linked to the overall developmental trajectory of the country, which means to the productive forces. And that is how you find, in the initial decades, institutions like the agricultural scientists, agricultural sciences, IITs were developed. And that's how we produce some of the finest engineers, of course, with state funding, because we wanted to achieve something, something that Pakistan couldn't do, and became a victim of what I call comprador bourgeoisie. And here we created our own system. Now, where are we now? So and as my predecessors have also pointed out, Dr. Abhishek and all, research and development is going to be one of the key parameters. The two elements that I want to focus. That doesn't mean that we lose sight of our self-sufficiency on agriculture. Of course, that has to be the focus. So therefore, the education has to be oriented in that direction. But imagine if you are living in a condition where 95% of countries' computing power is only in 5 big companies of the world, then what is Viksit Bharat for me? Then which area of education has to serve me to attain self-sufficiency in Viksit Bharat? I think therefore this focus on the whole question of artificial intelligence, the whole question of data sciences, data analytics, data not to be becoming another tool of capital accumulation and aggrandizement for a few, but actually legitimizing it, democratizing it. And I think education has to play a pivotal role, where the focus of the budget and the state per se, union per se, the provincial governments can't do that. Exactly what China is doing, the whole question of interoperability that I'm talking about. If there's any threat to these major 5 transnational corporations in the world, it comes from China. Why doesn't it come from us? We cannot afford to be lackeys of these. If all the computing power is. So if computing power is going to be one of the decisive factors, then I think our education needs a little tilt shift in this direction. That's the first point. The second point is we are massively shifting, because that's my favorite domain, Kalyan Ramanji, and we are massively shifting towards the largest number of Homo sapiens in the world. Urban Homo sapiens living in the world, it's a matter of few decades, 1 or 2, would be Indians. What does it mean? We cannot afford to build cities where people die of pollution. I mean, we just heard our famous Geeta Gopinath speaking. I feel bad for ourselves, to be very honest. I cannot imagine where 45% of the people live in slums. So which sector should my research and development? It's not that difficult. Like Dr. Abhishek was pointing out, to manage our shit and waste, something that we were managing 5,500 years ago in Mohenjo-daro and Harappa. We can do that. The point is, why are we not doing it? So I think that focus has to be there. The whole question of quality, we have to manage it because people are shifting. So I find these two major transitions in building. So, what kind of plans are to be built. Another funny anecdote, because, movement actually throws you. Kalyan Ramanji, if you ever come to Delhi and try to buy a house, because Trump's son is having 2 towers in Gurgaon. Even if you have 10 CR, I think the flat costs 10 CR. Whether you'll be able to get a house or not, he will take your interview. He will first judge you, is this the way how we're building a city? So education has to play a pivotal role. And the state per se has to give a direction to that. I mean, we can go for social housing. I mean, it's not a big deal. But what kind of social housing? Climate resilient if people are dying in cities. So, the whole question of digital and the cities, of course, not to miss the point, self-sufficiency, that will lead us to Viksit Bharat, to a self-reliant India and a prosperous India, I think. But it's a very interesting question. I thought I must just poke in my nose here. Thank you.
Sure. I don't think sovereign AI is in the perspective of the government. Even at Davos, we were graded poorly for not having our own sovereign AI.
Yeah, but
Secondary and
so Yanis Varoufakis and I, we were discussing this in the BRICS conference, why it is so very important. Else we are completely compromised if we do not have that.
But the government does want to use AI in education, primary education especially. There may be a rollout
Yes.
during the budget. Okay, we'll see. We will flash some more questions. We are celebrating a 1.28 lakh crore budget for high-tech peaks like AI and IITs. And 88 lakh students have vanished from government schools in just 1 year. Is the state inadvertently funding a budgetary paradox, effectively paying for the high-tech funeral of our primary education system to build an elite third generation ceiling? Does this worry our panelists? Is this a natural process that government schools are being shut down, and many government schools have recorded a drop in the number of students over the years? Is that a problem at all, or should we look at it differently?
Okay, I'll give my initial remarks. See, this is, first of all, thank you, Adya. I couldn't see the name of the person, but yeah, good question. Good question.
Adhyasakti Maharani. Yes.
Yes. See, it is not an either-or problem. We need to solve problems. We are a huge country, and there are the largest student population of the world, right? So there are problems at multiple levels to be solved, and every problem does not have a single solution. We do not have a paracetamol type sarva roga nivarani. You cannot have one solution for all problems of education. No, we need to look at in a tiered way. Certain problems have to be resolved. Public good has to be resolved by the government. Certain places where we need private sector, we have to bring in private sector, right? But in a very careful way. Coming to primary education, yes, government has to see people who can't afford to go to a private school would look at public school, and it is the responsibility of the government, federal, state, put together, to make affordable education possible, meaningful education possible for everyone who wants to. Correct. That's our directive, primary directive. Now, in earlier conversation, Dr. Abhishek made a very interesting observation. That is, people are moving. Parents don't want their children to go to public school, right? They want to go to private school. We have to honestly ask that question. Why is that happening? Right. So where do we fix that problem? Number one, if the quality is a problem, that quality has to be fixed, right? The quality of teachers, the quality of infrastructure. See, infrastructure can be fixed with relative ease. Not that easy, but relatively speaking, right? But quality of trained faculty members is again a public good. That there has to be a way of ensuring teachers are available, good quality teachers are available at the education level. That's one. Second, slightly different point. This has some echoing from the NEP as well. There are a lot of studies which look at countries, China, Germany, Japan, Korea. Now we somehow have this myth of English language. I know we are currently speaking in English. A lot of discussion happens in English, right? This English language myth that only those who are educated in English are intelligent. I mean, somehow the English knowledge competency is used as a barometer for intelligence of a person, right? That is hurting us at many levels, right? So we probably one of the colonial hangover or vestige of some of the things. We need that language, but then that language cannot become a barometer for measurement of. So what probably happens is, even many of the private school, the state schools, probably the parents look at, what is the quality of infrastructure, what is the quality of education, and then somewhere at the back of their mind they feel that, even if it is expensive, if I go to a private school, my child would be able to do better, maybe get a better job. That's a kind of thinking. At one level maybe that's happening, but there is also another danger that is creeping in. Okay. This private education over the years, and this is where unfortunately some of the things that we shouldn't be importing from abroad, we are importing it in the private education space, starting from school. Okay. And I see it in MBA education as well, the spillover of that. Looking at education as a business leads to treating students as a client, and that significantly impacts a teacher-student relationship, right? And we don't realize that it takes 2 decades. Over 2 decades, you notice what would happen. People coming out of high school and then they move into higher education, maybe MBA and other higher level master's education. Gradually, you would see that happening. Ability to take critical feedback, put in effort, do independent research and inquiry, rather than mugging up. There's a lot of things, and the school also doesn't want to take a stand of wanting to put the students through the difficult process of learning and asking tough questions. So you see, it's a mixture of a lot of things that's happening.
Okay, I will feel this question for the last. Shampa Paul, she's asking, we have data from many European countries now. Karolinska Institute of Sweden has found that excessive tech in classrooms and learning in general causes more harm rather than helping them. Sweden has invested money into bringing back traditional methods to their classrooms recently, and Norway and Denmark is following them. So is India weighing the cons of excessive tech in learning? In fact, the government is planning an increased rollout of tech in education, especially in primary education. And we do have these reports from European countries that tech doesn't work actually. It actually does more harm than good. There has been a rollback there. So, but I will ask this question to Abhishek. What do you think the government should do? Should they go on and use tech as a low-cost solution for the problems in primary education, even higher education, which the government has been doing? There's so many. The UDISE is sort of encouraging students to take online courses. 40% of courses can be from online. It can be from the Swayam portal. So there is a tendency to increasingly deploy tech, possibly even AI, in addressing some issues in primary education. But do you think the government should continue doing that? Are they planning to? I will ask Abhishek to weigh in.
I think the first point that I would make is that we shouldn't put too much energy in fighting technology. I mean, technology is going to be, it is a part of our life and it is only going to increase. So how much should we use it? If we keep on debating that, I think we've already lost a lot in that debate and we shouldn't debate much on that. Now, till what extent and at what level? I was just during the last question when we were talking about primary education and implementation, listening to Professor Iyer, what came to my mind was about the ITIs that we had. We had the vision back in 1950s. Jawaharlal Nehru ji had set up ITIs. We had the vision that time. We made the allocation that time. It all boiled down to the implementation. We are still talking of reviving IITs, which were set up in 1950s. And now how are we reviving them? Again, with the help of technology. I was just reading a few months back that I think TCS has signed an MOU with the UP government that they'll be investing around 5,000 crores in reviving ITIs by technology, because technology is going to be part of it now. Now we have to, we should not fight technology. And when we have to talk about it at primary education level, I think comparing ourselves with European countries, I'm not sure how far that would be right, given the fact that we have a lot of infrastructure crisis in our country and we have a huge population to cater to. So I think their scenario and our scenario is way too different. I think if we can use the technology smartly, we'll be able to probably cover a larger audience. We might be able to educate a larger number of people than if we focus only on having people in our classrooms, because we are very well aware of the infrastructure that we have in say tier 2 or tier 3 cities, or and the situation only worsens if we go into the rural areas. So if we do not make use of technology at that point, I hope that in fact I would want us to make use of technology so that those students who are sitting in those areas are also they can also get access to good education. So I think I would still want to be in favor of technology.
Okay, point taken, Abhishek. I will give the last word to Thikender. He summing up. What do you think? Give us a summary of your positions and what do you think the government should do?
The government should do in what direction, Kalyan Ramanji? In broadly, or
You take a call. You take a call. You take a call.
so I think the government should, like I said, actually get its feet together, bring in all these major institutions together, and also try to create a dialogue and a process where this creativity is harnessed. There's phenomenal creativity that exists all around our campuses, as Professor Iyer was also pointing out. The point is, how do we harness this creativity? This creativity can only be harnessed if we allow huge amount of autonomy exist in the campuses, and then try to, as we used to say in our university days, let 100 flowers bloom, and then you can allow all those 100 flowers to bloom with their respective creative consciousness, because India is such a diverse country. And as Dr. Abhishek was pointing out, that in the 50s we were clear. So I think there has to be a clarity of vision. What would be the productive forces that we need to unleash in another 10 years, 20 years down the line? And I think education has to be part and parcel of that. Unless we have that clarity, I do not see, and that's exactly some of the flaws that have already been pointed out. You give Center of Excellence 100 crore rupees, people are afraid, they don't even know how to spend that money. So I think that clarity is something very, very important to get this linkage between what we foresee as our future, what I call self-reliant future into the Viksit Bharat, as the government is claiming, and how can education play a pivotal role in that. Education cannot be diverse from that, and of course allowing that whole amount of critical the whole amount of criticality in the situation to bloom. Unfortunately, I do not see that criticality happening. That is what is the dire need of the hour. And then we can build nuances, projects. Government cannot be a project-oriented process. I've handled and seen enough of that. I think the government has to be at a larger narrative, at a larger picture. Thanks.
Okay, point taken. I hope people are listening. We had a wonderful discussion. We need to wind this up. We've run out of time. We will meet another time next Saturday, 5 p.m. for another discussion on education. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.